Good morning, class. Today we're going to go over the lactate pathways between the muscle and the liver. Just give you a little bit of insight. Blood lactate concentrations reflect lactate production and clearance. The clearance of lactate from the blood reflects a return to homeostasis and thus the person's ability to recover. Lactate can be cleared by oxidation within the muscle fiber in which it was produced, or it can be transported in the blood to other muscle fibers to be oxidized. Lactate can also be transported in the blood to the liver, where it is converted to glucose. The process is referred to as the Cori cycle. So we're going to go over the Cori cycle today. There's two types of the Cori cycle. In the liver, you have gluconeogenesis occurs, which we'll go into detail there. And in the muscle, you have glycolysis occurs. First, we're going to look at 5 different questions that we're going to kind of go over and answer today for you. What are the key steps of the pathways illustrated in your diagram? What are these pathways affected by exercise intensity and training adaptations? How do lactate and lactic acid differ? That's an important one. Can lactate be used metabolically? If so, under what conditions? We'll go into there, how the energy is produced there metabolically. And are the consequences of lactate accumulation on our ability to sustain energy? Are there, the typo. What other key factors are at work at the cellular level that could cause exercise cessation? So first, we're going to go over question 1. What are the key steps in illustrated pathways? So here we have our Cori cycle. In the Cori cycle, we're going to go over the 5 different steps on how energy is produced through the Cori cycle. The Cori cycle involves 2 organs, like I mentioned, a contracting muscle and the liver. It functions in anaerobic conditions when muscles are contracting under reduced oxygen, so when oxygen is at a very limited rate. The contracting muscles produce lactate instead of pyruvate, which would be proceeding to the acetyl coenzyme A in the citric acid cycle, which we went over in our first presentation, which is supplied to the liver. So it's transporting here. In the liver, gluconeogenesis occurs or converts lactate to pyruvate and glucose, so forming that pathway. Glucose is then metabolized by the contracting muscle via glycolysis to pyruvate and acetyl coenzyme A only under aerobic conditions if there's sufficient oxygen present. The acetyl coenzyme A would then enter the citric acid cycle. Otherwise, the glucose goes through the anaerobic glycolysis all over again. So the pathway here, it either goes and forms the ATP and moves on to the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, or moving back down into the Cori cycle. And so otherwise, the glucose goes through anaerobic glycolysis, and the Cori cycle goes on till oxygen is sufficient enough. The biomechanical reactions of the Cori cycle in livers synthesize glucose from the lactate released from the active muscles. This gluconeogenic process helps maintain carbohydrate reverses, which is the primary source of energy that will be used. Next question we're going to go over are how are these pathways affected by exercise and training adaptations? In intense exercise, or intense physical activity, I should say, about 80% or higher of aerobic capacity, with elevated carbohydrate catabolism, the glycogen within inactive tissues supply the needs of the muscle. Active glycogen turnover through the exchangeable lactate pool progresses because inactive tissues release lactate to the circulation. Provide a precursor to synthesize carbohydrate to support blood glucose levels, the concomitant exercise energy requirements. Blood lactate accumulation is greater following high-intensity intermittent exercise such as resistance training and short duration sprint, so 100% activity or 90% or higher, following lower intensity continuous exercise such as marathon runners, long duration runs, slow energy like there. However, trained people experience lower blood lactate concentrations than untrained people with it, or when exercising at an absolute workload. This indicates that resistance training results in alterations in lactate response similar to those from aerobic endurance training. These alterations include lower blood lactate concentrations at a given workload in trained individuals and higher blood lactate concentrations in trained individuals during maximal exercise. So they can kind of be related within the blood lactate concentration, so where it is present within the body and how it's used, basically where the oxygen is present. So it's when is the oxygen efficient enough to not use lactate as a response. Next question we're going to go over is, how does lactate and lactic acid differ? Very important question, because a lot of people get this wrong. They think they're the same thing, but they do kind of mingle with each other. They kind of have the same. It basically depends on if there's an ion present, and we're going to kind of go in a little bit of detail here. Lactic acid and lactate are not the same substance. The glycolytic energy pathway produces lactic acid, which when quickly dissociates, releasing an hydrogen ion. So hydrogen is the main component here. The remaining compound then combines with sodium ions and potassium ions to form a salt called lactate. Blood lactate and not lactic acid is the substance usually measured in athletes under laboratory conditions. So lactic acid and lactate are conjugate acids and base off of each other. Chemically, their difference is having and not having hydrogen, like I said right here earlier. Lactic acid is a weak acid, but is stronger than acetic acid. Lactate is an anion produced from lactic acid. When lactic acid is dissolved in water, it tends to dissociate and produces a lactate ion and proton. So the majority of lactic acid in the body is dissociated and present in the form of lactate. Therefore, lactate is the conjugate base of lactic acid. Lactate is important for brain metabolism during exercise. And during exercise, lactate is produced in muscles, where lactic acid is not. So there we have it on the difference between lactate and lactic acid. Next, we're going to go over the metabolic, can lactate be used metabolically? If so, under what conditions? So when oxygen is present, or when oxygen supply is insufficient, typically during intense muscular activity, energy must be released through anaerobic metabolism. Lactic acid fermentation converts pyruvate to lactate by lactate dehydrogenase. Mostly importantly, fermentation regenerates NAD+, maintaining the NAD+ concentration so that additional glycolysis reactions can occur. The fermentation step oxidizes the NADH produced by glycolysis back to NAD+, transferring 2 electrons from NADH to reduce pyruvate into lactate. Instead of accumulating inside the muscle cells, lactate produced by anaerobic fermentation is taken up in the liver. This initiates the other half of the Cori cycle. In the liver, gluconeogenesis occurs. From the intuitive perspective, gluconeogenesis reverses both glycolysis and fermentation by converting lactate first into pyruvate and finally back to glucose. The glucose is then supplied to the muscle through the bloodstream. It is ready to be fed into further glycolysis reactions if muscle activity has stopped. The glucose is used to replenish the supplies of glucose through glucogenesis. Overall, the glycolysis part of the cycle produces 2 ATP at the cost of 6 ATP molecules consumed in gluconeogenesis part. Each iteration of the cycle must maintain a net consumption of 4 ATP molecules. As a result of the cycle, the cycle cannot be sustained indefinitely. The intense consumption of ATP molecules indicates that the Cori cycle shifts the metabolic burden from the muscles to the liver. So it can be used metabolically. It just depends on how long you can sustain that process of producing ATP, because it physically cannot last for that long. So our last question that we have today: Are there consequences of lactate accumulation on our body and our ability to sustain energy? What other factors are at work at the cellular level that could cause exercise cessation? So light activity during the post-exercise period has been shown to increase lactate clearance rates in both aerobically trained and anaerobically trained athletes. Like I said, aerobically trained and anaerobically trained athletes have faster lactate clearance rates than untrained people. Peak blood lactate concentrations occur approximately 5 minutes after cessation of exercise. A delay frequency attributed to the time required to buffer and transport lactic acid from the tissue to the blood. The exercise intensity or relative intensity at which blood lactate begins to abrupt increases above baseline concentration has been termed the lactate threshold. So here we have it: untrained and trained individuals. This is the lactate threshold training effect. The lactate threshold represents an increasing reliance on anaerobic metabolism or mechanisms. Therefore, the lactate threshold corresponds well with the ventilatory threshold, or is often known as a marker of the anaerobic threshold. The LT typically begins at 50 to 60% of maximal oxygen uptake in untrained individuals. So it's about 50 to 60% where you start to see that spike. And at 70 to 80% in trained athletes. So it takes a little bit longer for that threshold to take place, for them to start peaking at their workload, or their work rate, I should say. A second increase in lactate accumulation has been noted at a higher related intensities of exercise. Onset of blood lactate accumulation is the second point of inflection. So the amount of blood lactate that the body is accumulating at the time, this breaks the lactate accumulation curve like I said, the break in the lactate accumulation curve may correspond to the point at which intermediate and large motor units are recruited during increasing activity. So once you start to see this spike, you see that onset of blood lactate accumulation. So it's starting to pool, and it's that intermediate effect of what could cause the lactate accumulation over the ability to sustain energy. So the more trained of an athlete you are, the longer you'll be able to sustain that energy. The less trained you are, the less you'll be able to conserve that energy, and that threshold will be reached. So like I said, if you have any questions on any of our topics today, feel free to ask. Hope everyone has a great day. Here is just a little bit of where I got there's our questions. Wrong slide. Last one. Here's my sources, the sources that I used for today. So hope everyone has a great day. Have a good one. Bye.